Our Lady of Guadalupe and the Conquest of Darkness. This is Father Kevin Vogel. I'm pleased to continue presenting this kind of lesson about Our Lady of Guadalupe and how God was able to send his mother, our Blessed Virgin Mary, to the people of Mexico during this time in which to draw them out of the kind of deep darkness of evil that had overcome their land and help them come to know the true and real God. So we've looked at the kind of darkness they were in the first video. The last video that we had, we looked at the kind of spiritual conquest and what God was going to do to begin to bring about the conversion of this people to help them know him. And in this video, we're going to look specifically kind of at some science and the miraculous. So the nature of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe that Mary gave to all of us through Juan Diego, we're going to look that it has some kind of miraculous features to it. So if we begin looking at this, here is an image of the image that was on the tilma. And so the tilma itself was a kind of cloak made of natural fibers, agave fabric. And the kind of miraculous thing is that, I mean, this image, you can still go and see it at the shrine at the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe there in Mexico City today. And it's still there, which is kind of amazing because this agave fabric, assuming that there was nothing special particular about this poor man Juan Diego's cloak, I mean, it was regular fiber. There's no signs of any decay on the fibers themselves. Similar fiber of that kind deteriorates normally within 20 years, but the tilma has now lasted almost 470 years from that time. Also, I mean, there's obviously discoloration that has been gathered from candle smoke, but that really, I mean, there hasn't been any kind of damage that's noticeable to the fabric itself, even having been left completely unprotected for the first 116 years of the image's display. I mean, today when you go there, it's encased in glass, and so it's very well protected now. But I mean, for the first number of years, there wasn't any kind of, greater protection. So that's kind of unknown. How did such an image last for so long and retain the state in which we find it today? Another interesting thing about the fabric and the image is just some certain features that we see. So you can look at this image and you might see there's kind of like a line going straight down the middle. Well, what that is a seam in the fabric. So when this tilma was created, they sewed larger pieces together when they wove it, and so you have a seam straight down the middle. Now, if this was a painter, regular painting it, I mean, you wouldn't think a painter would choose a canvas where you have this obvious seam going right down the center of it. It's once we point it out, you can kind of see it very well. It's normally they wouldn't use it. You wouldn't think, But the interesting thing is that there's flaws that we find in the fabric are in a sense incorporated into the very image itself. So a very good example is when you look at the lips on Mary's face. There is a kind of knot and fibers that help that give kind of a dimension, a volume to the lips and the nose of her face. And so when people make their own copies of it, for devotional purposes, it's very difficult for them to kind of copy the face of the Blessed Mother because of this kind of three-dimensional aspect to the very canvas itself. How would an artist just choosing, a random canvas, and not a very good canvas at that, right? This kind of rough agave cloak, how would they, be able to work in such details with such precision? Seems a bit interesting. The other interesting thing that we find here is that it's not painted, at least in any way that we know of paint. There's really no kind of primer coat to keep the colors from running, from soaking in to the cloth. And in fact, you can actually see the image through the cloth, through front and back, but it's not distorted as on other cases you might expect it to be if it's painted on one side. There's no discernible brush strokes. The color seems to be like directly placed and impregnated into the fibers of the cloth itself. And there's no kind of protective varnish, no kind of coating over the top, and somehow the colors still remain vibrant. I mean, oftentimes if you don't have any kind of protection, the elements can cause the colors to dim and fade and lose their brilliance. But colors remain bright and vibrant. There hasn't been any discernible change that we've noticed. But looking at it more closely, a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Richard Kuhn, put it through some tests and discovered that, he couldn't determine any kind of known natural material that was used for the pigments. And of course, synthetic colorings were not available in 1531, so that's not an option for human painters to use. Again, another kind of study by Americans Callahan and Smith in 1979. There was some study with infrared rays. Once again, they couldn't find any trace of like a known paint or any kind of treatment to the fabric to make it last longer. They did note on there an aspect of iridescence. So iridescence, we often find this in colorations on plants or animals, right? When you look at the color from different angles, it kind of changes its hue. This is a kind of iridescence. Now we actually can't. We know how to do that today, but it's been pretty recent when we figured out how to artificially reproduce this phenomenon that we find naturally. It wasn't until about 1999 when we figured out how to actually do that in paint to reproduce that kind of iridescence. So certainly, if it was a human painter, how would this occur back in the 1500s? Other miraculous aspects to it is how it's been protected from damage. So one instance, going back to 1795, there was a worker who was cleaning and accidentally spills nitric acid upon the right side of the tilma. So I kind of have a zoomed in image there. You can see the kind of discoloration there. But nitric acid should have dissolved the fibers themselves, and it didn't. And even if the fibers would have made it, certainly would have dissolved the colors. And you can see the stain there runs into the colors with very little change to the colors. Obviously, we can see kind of the stain from when it occurred, but other than that stain, it's relatively unharmed. Then in 1921, there was a bomb that was planted that went off near the altar in the church and caused a lot of damage to the interior building. So, for example, there's an image of the altar crucifix that was on the altar, and it's bent completely over, being made of metal. But the image itself, which is we'll show later in an image, it's right above the altar. It was left unharmed. So this kind of moments of seemingly miraculous being protected from harm. Now, when people talk about miraculous aspects of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, they'll sometimes bring in some things which I think we can have a certain amount of kind of skepticism about, that may or may not be something. So there's an important kind of mathematical or psychological phenomenon that we need to be aware of, that is our human mind likes to find patterns, and so we can easily put patterns in places where there isn't any kind of meaningful pattern. So if you have enough data points, you can actually find patterns that aren't there. But you have so much data points that if you can selectively pick points of data from all of the different data that's there, you can find certain patterns. So, for example, people have done this with the Bible. They call it the Bible code. Well, they'll count off a certain number of letters, and they'll find it spells out words. So you can see in this image, the red circles spell out Bible, and the blue squares spell out code. And so by counting the same number of letters in between those letters, you can find this word that's spelled out. Well, the problem is that there's so many letters within the different books of the Bible, and so many different kind of combinations that you can do this kind of thing and find and make it find and say almost anything you want. So the Bible code is not a real thing. It's not an actual secret code that's being written in the Bible this way. But our human mind will try to find patterns sometimes and find things that actually aren't meaningful and aren't there. So just a word of caution as we move on to these next ones, because these next ones could be cases in which we find patterns where there aren't actually patterns. But it could be the case in which these actually are real things going on. So one of the things that has been pointed out by some is they look at the arrangement of the stars in Mary's mantle. There's stars that are placed there. And so what some will say is that the arrangement of those stars in the mantle correspond with actual constellations in the night sky as the way we would see them on December 12th in 1531. But an added interesting thing is that they're kind of mirror imaged. It's, if you look at them from not from Earth, but from outside the Earth, kind of like God's point of view. Now, perhaps this is actually part of something that God was speaking through that. But at the same time, we want to be a little bit cautious before we say that for sure, because there are many, many stars. That's a lot of data points to deal with, and so it's a possibility that they could. And as you see here, these are combinations of different of a few stars from several different constellations that you find on the mantle. And it's just, I don't know. You can have a healthy amount of skepticism as to whether or not, this is actually that these stars on her actually represent this or not. Perhaps they do. It would be very interesting if they do, but I think we want to have a certain amount of kind of reserve when we look at some of these things. Also, there was someone by the name of Jose Este Tonsman. He was an engineer working at Cornell University. He'd worked for 20 years IBM, and now he's with the Mexican Center for Guadalupe Studies. And so applying some of his scientific imaging, digital imaging that he'd used from his former work, he applied it to the tilma. And so he's done extensive work by looking at the tilma. And he used digital processes used by satellites and other probes in transmitting visual information. And what he has seemed to have found were figures of people within the eyes of Mary. Sounds like and figures of the people that were actually there. Actually, that would have been in the eyes of Mary at the moment her image appeared. So I'll explain this. Now, there actually is something of a scientific basis for this. So if we take photographs, if you take a photograph of someone, and if you have good enough resolution in that photograph, you actually can see reflections of objects in people's eyes. So there's actually, a study that was done through the School of Psychology at the University of Glasgow, and they were able to, by taking these high-resolution photographs, they were able to recover images of people reflected in the cornea of the eye. So, this kind of thing actually is a real thing. Now, whether or not there actually are images within the eyes of Mary in this image, we could have a certain amount of skepticism, because so they'll say that in here we see 13 people. Some of them are the same that are in both eyes, because but from slightly different angles, and they seem perhaps to be the proportions reflecting the different proportions you'd see from the offset, point of view of the human eyes. But one of the reasons why I put this as a not for sure whether or not this is a thing is because it's such low resolution, and there's so much. It's very staticky. Are we trying to find images that are those images actually there, or are we just trying to find things? See, they're not very clear in there. Is our human eyes trying to find images and make faces out of that kind of background noise? It would be very interesting if this is actually and this is part of the miraculous thing with the image. But I find some of the earlier ones more compelling, even though this is interesting. And finally, I think the one that at least I tend to be the most skeptical about is people have tried to take the stars on Mary's mantle and put them on a music staff and create a song out of them. Now, once again, this in my mind is like, well, it seems very much like trying to find a pattern where there isn't necessarily a pattern. Here you're turning Mary on her side, and you're putting music staff, with stars, and you're choosing. There's a lot of imprecision, I would think, that could go into this, and so they produce, and then but the song that they produce from this, it's interesting to listen to, so we can kind of listen to it here for a moment. So, one of the things that I see with it is like, well, it's kind of a melody, though there really isn't a clear kind of set melody in my mind. So I guess my concern would be is that we don't want to impose patterns that are not actually supposed to be there. And sometimes we can get caught up in some of these aspects of the nature of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, when I think there's an even more important aspect to this. And that we'll cover in the next video, as we look at, how is Mary as our mother going to speak to her children? There's a very, up to that point, the Franciscans had not been very easily been able to speak God's message of salvation and love to them. And so they need a way in which they can understand who God is. And so Mary is going to use this image with our Blessed Mother is going to be the way in which God is going to be able to kind of break through that divide and to bring his children to himself. God bless.